So welcome to the Introduction to Ethics in America, to our ethics course. Glad you could all come out here tonight. First of all, then, I want to show you what some people think philosophy is. This shows you a philosophical field trip. People come out into empty space. You mean this is it? And there's really nothing to hold on to. Philosophy seems to be just all in the mind. For many people, we look for some kind of a security, something solid, and in philosophy everything seems to move around and it doesn't seem to make much sense. Often it appears like this here, like a puzzle, and the pieces don't seem to fit together. Sometimes they do seem to fit. When we look at the history of philosophy and treat philosophy historically, looking back, why did people start doing philosophy? It maybe starts to begin to make a little more sense. I want to show you a picture over which I usually ask students to meditate, to look at it for a while. All of these pictures actually, in a normal classroom setting, I ask students to look at it for a longer period and have your feedback and have you think about what it could mean. This picture specifically tells us quite a bit about the story of philosophy. I don't know, it's if you recognize it, it's sort of an Eastern picture. Some people would call it a mandala. Your mind focuses towards the center, and in the center there's a triangle, and those triangles keep repeating themselves into the outer circuits of the picture. Meditating about it, thinking about it, what would it tell us? That life has a focus, that it is not like this, where everything is scattered, that there is some kind of a focus somewhere. And that was the realization of the early philosophers. Philosophy started in Greece. And then to say even that philosophy started in Greece may be a mistake, because philosophy, all people had some kind of a philosophy. The Greeks were different insofar that they started to philosophize in a systematic manner. They made a system out of it. They invented logic. Why the Greeks? Now there are several reasons. People usually would bring three easy ones. The Greeks were prosperous. Their land produced quite a bit, so they had time to sit around. They did a lot of traveling to foreign cultures, so they had a lot of contact with other cultures. And today, just in the last 20 years, we have found quite some interesting evidence how far the Greeks actually traveled and what kind of a contact people had in those days. As far as India, we have today connections. We know about connections between Pythagoras, who was one of the first philosophers, and early Indian philosophy. So somehow they were in communication with each other, even as far as China. One reason that is not often mentioned, and I'd like you to consider a timeline of philosophy. I want to put that on the board here. This is not, here we go. A timeline. 0 here, the beginning of our time was the birth of Christ. 400 to 600, this is the BC, the time when major philosophy in Greece developed. 300, you could say. This was the high time of Greek Athenian democracy. 800, we have the first written documents. Incidentally, that's one of the reasons too why the Greeks are so important, because they left us a whole body of books and writings, and we can go back to them. All other cultures had their philosophies, as I said before, because philosophy is mostly concerned with two things: with how to live a happy life and where do we come from? What is the meaning of this life? So if we go further back here, the first written documents are Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they write about a period 1200 BC. The battle for Troy, and then Odysseus' trip back home. We know now that there was a very extensive culture existing before this time, not only in Greece. They were centered in Greece on Crete, on the island of Crete, but also in India. And something happened around this period, 1600 to 1200, that made that early culture disappear. It destroyed it. And out of the ruins, basically, philosophy developed. So philosophy was a response to the question, why are we not as happy anymore as people used to be in the olden days? The early philosophers, the early historians, in this time period here, already talked about a golden age that has been lost. Remember in the Bible? Paradise. Same story. There was at one point a time when people lived in relative peace with each other. And before, say, 1960, people sort of just assumed, well, maybe that's just made up. Maybe it's just their desires for peace. They didn't think that there was actually a period when people lived peacefully together. We know now, today, we have found archaeological evidence that there was a very long period of thousands of years where people lived actually in harmony with each other. And some scholars today say that the reason for that harmony was that because in those days men and women had equal status. There was not a difference between a hierarchy, a holy order, a natural order, between the two sexes where the men were the dominators and women were underneath. Ever since domination was established, people also tried to find out what is lost. They had some good ideas, but mostly they were wrong in trying to find the answers. So we have 2,000 years of philosophy. One could say today basically looking for the wrong answers. Finding some good answers, and we certainly shouldn't throw it all out. Certainly it makes sense to be logical. But to be just logical and forget that the purpose of life is not being logical, but the purpose of life is to be happy, isn't it? To survive. Sometimes logic helps us to survive. Sometimes logic helps us to be happy. But what logic most of all has done is giving a tool to those who are in power to keep that power. And that's what the Greeks have started, and it went all through Western civilization. When Western civilization came in contact with other civilizations, India, Africa, they looked always, America of course too, they looked down upon those cultures because they thought that they had the answers. Now they never really did have the answers. They just followed the Greek idea that the answer is available, it's somewhere out there. Question is, where did it come from, if the answer is out there? And that it is possible for the human mind to know that answer. So those who are on the way to finding the answer, Western civilization, always thought that they were better than everybody else because they didn't think anybody else was even looking. Well, they were looking too. They were looking for how to live a happy life, which is what Greek philosophy started out with. But somehow it got perverted into looking who is right and who is wrong. This is why I say when we do ethics today, it's still about how to live a happy life. And that means for different people, different things. Where Aristotle said, it means for all people the same thing. Hardly anybody today would agree with that anymore, that it means for all people the same thing, right? Happiness. Aristotle said that everything in nature strives for happiness. But that happiness, is the result of a long a long journey towards perfection. Striving for perfection. Journey towards perfection. Also, human history is striving towards perfection. And Western civilization is a little more perfect than everybody else. That gives them the right to subdue, conquer, kill, go out in the world and make them all follow their own ideas. The right in their minds, basically, it gave them a justification. Go ahead.
Now, were they equating perfection with happiness?
Aristotle certainly did.
So
and here we come then to, good question.
So if you didn't reach perfection, then
you weren't quite happy. You could only reach perfection, you could only reach happiness if you reached that perfection exactly. So that brings us back then to the question, what is out there? Plato said, perfection is given by who? By the gods. It's built into nature. You can find that same idea, Plato, Aristotle. It became then Western civilization's idea, and obviously also the Christian church's idea. And Islam followed too. Judaism, Islam, same idea. Perfection is built into nature by God. And so our job is to read nature as if it was a book, understand it, and then we will live a happy life if we live in harmony with nature. And to some extent that does make sense. The problem is, did we read nature right? Do we read nature right? That's the real problem. I still believe that Aristotle was on the right track. If we read nature right and live then in harmony with that nature, it should work out. Not to say that before that we're not quite happy, but maybe we aren't. If we would understand. Today we know, and it is pretty much scientific, that nature is an experimentation, a house, a laboratory for experimentation going in all different directions. There is no one plan according to which everything develops. That's what the Greeks thought. And then it became Christian heritage, Western civilization's heritage. That there was one plan. And for us, it was just the question to discover that plan, know that plan, and live accordingly. And then, of course, once that was taken over, was merged with, once Greek thinking merged with Christian Judaic thinking, in the 3rd century, the first wave of merger, 12th, 13th century, the second merger under Thomas Aquinas. At that point, then, especially as it became science, first during the Middle Ages, the church said that instead of looking into nature, we look into the Bible because God told us how we should read the nature. And then under the influence of science, beginning with Thomas Aquinas, who referred back to Aristotle, saying we should look in nature, God put everything into nature, then we'll understand what the right way is, how the house is built, and then we can live accordingly. I usually show a little demonstration object here takes me a while when I do it in class, but I ask students to do something and make a mess, basically. And then I ask students, what would you do with it? And after a while, some students come up and they build like a house, or inevitably somebody will build what? A pyramid. Why a pyramid? It's really strange, but people do. I have not seen a class that does not build eventually a pyramid. So I let them build a pyramid, and then of course there are those who, when I say, now let's do something more, then they come and smash it, because that's our instinct too. Order and chaos is human and is nature. Where the Greeks said, chaos is a mistake. Order is how everything should be. And there is something to that. When we build this pyramid, and I'm coming to like a point like this, and I say, okay, this is it. We're finished. And you look at it and you say, hey, wait a minute, there's something missing. Why is there something missing? Why do we have a sense that there is something missing? Obviously, we all know now it's complete. Why? Why is this more complete than this? Yeah?
Because it's not finished.
Well, because it's not finished. But why can't we say, well, this is finished?
It's not symmetrical.
It's not symmetrical. Good point. Got a very good point. Symmetry is actually one of the ways nature shows us that there is a built-in nature, a built-in completion in nature. When they were close to here in the Fermi labs, they were discovering the basic particles of nature, quarks. They had discovered 5 quarks, and in the symmetry of things, there was one place open. So they said there must be a 6th quark, otherwise it's not symmetrical, because nature works symmetrical. We are built more or less symmetrical, more or less. Actually, modern physicists say the process of developing nature is symmetry breaking. In the beginning, there was high symmetry. And as we become more complex, we break those symmetries. So there is this symmetry. Symmetry is, we find symmetry more beautiful than non-symmetry. We are urged towards symmetry for some strange reason. So could we say then, well, okay, then there is something in nature that coerces us towards uniformity. Because if your symmetry is the same as my symmetry, why shouldn't it be the same in ethics? Why can't we say too that whatever I consider good, you should consider good too, because that makes it symmetrical. That makes it like for all the same. We have a little more problem there, don't we? But the Greeks firmly thought, yeah, there is an order in nature, and that order is discoverable. Plato actually, the first big philosopher, said that order is in our souls before my soul enters my body. Interesting that he had the idea of transmigration of souls, which Pythagoras before him also had. Remember the connection with India I said before? The Indians kept it. Buddhism kept it. In the West it was cut off, that concept. And it was actually then denied already by Aristotle, because logically he couldn't follow. Plato believed that my soul comes in my body equipped, knowing everything I need to know. The job of education then is, obviously when I look at a baby and ask, well, how much is 2 plus 2, the baby would know it. But Plato would say, yeah, the baby really does know it. It just doesn't know yet how to express it. It's there. So for Plato believes in innate ideas, innate the term innate, innatus, born in. You're born with those ideas, and Plato believes in that. You're born with everything you need to know, and education is basically only an awakening of your inner qualities that you already have. And it is, of course, the way you know everything, because your soul came from a place where everything was perfect. Remember perfection again, striving towards perfection. For Plato, it was first, you come from perfection. In this world, things are not quite perfect. So when I see the semblance of perfection, an unfinished pyramid, my soul all of a sudden completes the pyramid in my mind. And I say, aha, this is how it should be. Because I have that finished picture in my mind, in my soul. And soul is really the first level, a first expression that not today we would call mind. Psychology, psyche, is the Greek word for soul. It's soul science. As it becomes more science, we don't want to call it soul anymore. We call it mind. It's mind science. And since we don't even believe anymore that mind exists, we call it what? Science of human behavior in America mainly. Today we are looking again, I just took part in 2 big conferences. Where does mind originate? What is mind? We know there is something about us humans or that we have mind. And that is also part of the question that philosophy asked from the beginning. Because we couldn't explain mind. When we asked what is the meaning of life, philosophers came with the answer, well, there is this dead materia, this stuff I'm made out of, and then I'm thinking. And the two seem to be very different. So maybe that mind came from somewhere else into this dead materia. And that was the Greek answer, which was again taken over by Christianity. In ontology, the science of what is, ontology, the science of what is, I'm going to give you another graph here that shows you how philosophy is divided. Okay, you see here ontology, which is also called, that's the first big part of philosophy. I said ontos is the Greek word for being. What is? It asks the question, what is? And metaphysics is almost the same. Aristotle invented the term, and for Aristotle it just meant behind physics, behind the physical appearance of things, there is some other reality. And Plato said that reality is more real than the physical one. And secondly, the second big part of philosophy is then ethics. What is good and what makes us happy? What is good and what makes us happy? That's the most important. I would say that was the important question of philosophy. That's the central question still today. If any knowledge does not make us happy, why should we have it? And the third major part of philosophy is aesthetics. What is beautiful? And in that I come back to my pyramid here. What is beautiful? The Greek answer was symmetry is beautiful. Order is beautiful. Well, how did disorder get into the world? The Chinese said order and chaos are equal balancing forces. They are always there. And each one is as valid as the other. The Greeks said order is what the gods wanted. Disorder is the action of gods who don't know what they were doing, which then in Christianity were called devils or Satan, the destroyer, the diabolus, the spirit that turns things upside down, creates disorder. So in Western civilization, we have a very clear hierarchy with disorder or chaos on the bottom and order on the top. All right? It's very important to realize that, because today we have a new picture of nature. The Eastern picture of nature is much more in line with what modern science shows us about nature. That chaos and order are equally balancing forces. Actually, in nature, when a system moves too close to order, it creates its own tendency towards disorder, towards destruction. And the question will be why, yeah?
Would that be the theory behind the Eastern belief in yin and yang, everything has
Exactly.
balance and balances?
Exactly, right. Yin and yang is a balancing force. In Egyptian mythology, chaos was first. And chaos created itself, the Book of the Dead starts, like a snake body out of nothingness into order. But chaos and order, and here is then the reason why too much order is not good. Because we lose creativity. And it actually works, one can show in computer simulated systems on computer screens that a system that is too orderly cannot resist the onslaught of something new. When something new happens to a system that is too orderly, it's just toppled over. Everything falls. Where a system that has pockets of disorder built into its own mechanism, disorder then is absorbed and becomes part of the system. And so nature has taken that. Nature works with that. When things become too orderly, no fascist society in the world has sustained itself for any length. 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, when things become too orderly, something erupts to change. Very, very interesting kind of observation, and that is supported today by science.